It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Petitmengin. She welcomes questions but requests that you ask them at the end. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome to Claire Petitmengin.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy and honored to be with you today. I would like to thank very warmly the Office of Digital Learning, the Social Field Initiative Group, and especially Met Moll for inviting me today to give this presentation. Don't hesitate to stop me if you don't understand my French accent, but I would like to prefer that you keep the question on the content of my presentation for the end. Please. So this presentation will be devoted to microphenomenology, a new scientific discipline which enables us to study our lived experience very precisely. Microphenomenology was born out of the idea advocated by the biologist Francisco Varela in the context of his neurophenomenological project that to understand the functioning of the mind, science cannot rely only on the study of cerebral activity, but has to create a method to study human experience. It was a groundbreaking idea because until then, science was built on the exclusion of lived experience. Not only natural sciences, not only neuroscience, but even psychology. Scientific psychology has made remarkable progress, especially since the 80s, thanks to brain exploration techniques. But the more refined these techniques become, the more it becomes obvious that it is illusory to eliminate any reference to subjective experience. For example, what allows the experimenter to describe a brain area as visual, if not the observation of a correlation between its activation and the description by the subject of a visual experience? Beyond neurosciences, how can we claim to study inner processes such as emotion, mind wandering, or reading, without giving us the means to investigate the images, the inner discourses and feelings that the subject lives inside? Above all, how can we claim to study consciousness when eliminating the point of view of the conscious being? As Francisco Varela said, if we were to live out experience, it would be like cutting out one eye. I would say both. However, what is experience? What is experience? My lived experience, being the most personal and intimate thing about me, I think that I am familiar to it. Thank you very much. Welcome. So I think that I'm familiar with my experience and that it should not be very difficult to answer the question. To answer the question, what is experience, is rather simple. My experience is made of the sensations, feelings, emotions, thoughts, and actions that I live instant after instant. It might perhaps be difficult to find words. I have to slow down a little. To find words to describe some of these components, especially feelings and emotions, but they are immediately accessible to me. I cannot imagine for a moment that I could fail to perceive them or be misled about them. However, what do we really know about our lived experience? If I asked you to describe precisely how you proceed in writing a letter or a paper, or even in spelling a simple word, or what you are doing to understand me right now, it's very likely that in a first stage, I would obtain quite scanty descriptions. I would probably manage to collect the description of what you know about the processes of writing or understanding, of what you either heard or read on this topic. But in order to describe precisely the way you really proceed, it would be necessary to carry out a thorough examination. All of us, hopefully, know how to perform these actions: understanding, writing, reading. But we have only a very partial awareness of how we go about doing them. The main reason for this lack of awareness seems to be that our attention is almost completely absorbed into the content, the what or object of our experience, to the detriment of the experience itself, of the how. We are a little like blind persons exploring objects with the tip of their cane, whose attention is entirely directed toward the object, and who ignore the contact and variation of pressure of the cane in the palm of their hand, to use the well-known example of the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty. Like blind persons, we use this information in action, but usually it remains largely unrecognized, unnoticed, transparent in a way. For example, while writing an article, I'm completely absorbed in the content of the ideas I am trying to express, but I am hardly aware of the contact of my fingers on the pen or on the computer keys, of the tensions in my back, of the rapid succession of inner images, slight emotions and felt meanings, rapid evaluations and comparisons, which accompany and in fact constitute my activity of writing. This blindness does not only concern our intellectual process only, but also our intersubjective experience. Let's imagine that I'm talking, for example, with my colleague John in a cafe. My attention is completely focused on the content of our conversation. I'm not fully aware of the emotions triggered by the ideas we are exchanging. I'm hardly aware of the gestures John is making while speaking, and even hardly aware of my own gestures. Even as fundamental and pervasive experiences as our bodily and sensory experiences largely escape us. For example, as William James noted, when I make a movement, my interest in the object toward which the movement is directed masks the movement of the limb, as well as the inner sensation of movement in the muscles and joints that initiate the movement of the limb. When a sound occurs, my attention instantaneously focuses on the physical object at the origin of the sound, whose name and image immediately mask my experience. In a fraction of a second, I recognize the sound as the song of a blackbird on the plum tree, leaving myself, forgetting in a way my immediate experience of the song. The scientific article which has contributed the most to discredit spontaneous description of experience is an article by Nisbet and Wilson that you probably know. It was published in 1977. In this paper, the most cited one in cognitive science, almost 10,000 citations today, the two researchers draw from a series of experimental studies the conclusion that we have no introspective access to our cognitive processes. A Swedish team of cognitive scientists recently tried to challenge these conclusions through the following experiment. The experimenter shows the participants two pictures of women's faces and asks them to choose which one they find the most attractive. Immediately after, he shows the selected picture again and asks participants to explain the reasons for their choice. But in some cases, the picture which is represented is the one that was not chosen. Surprisingly, the participants detect the trick in only 20% of cases, and in 80% of cases, provide an explanation for the choice they did not make. This result seems to confirm that we have no introspective access to our choice processes, and by extension to all our cognitive processes. We decided to reproduce this experiment, but introduced for some choices, between the moment of the choice and the moment the subject are shown the wrong picture, a micro-phenomenological interview where they are helped to describe their choice processes through neutral and precise questions by a skilled interviewer. Here are our results. The colored part corresponds to the rate of detection of the manipulation. In the trials where subjects did not undergo the interview, our results are similar to those of Johansson. However, in the trials where subjects were assisted in the description of their choice, they detected the trick in 80% of cases. A second important result is that unguided participants, even when they are not fooled, only provide scanty descriptions, such as, I chose this one because she has a nice smile. They remain focused on the what of their choice, that is, the chosen or unchosen face. While guided participants provide very detailed descriptions of how they chose, of their choice processes. For example, the chronology of exploration of the features of the faces, or fleeting inner images which were evoked by the pictures, or subtle inner feelings which were used as choice criteria. 3,000 words versus only 200 words for the unguided reports. These results confirm that naive descriptions of our cognitive processes are usually poor and unreliable. But they show that guided participants do something special, perform specific acts, which enable them to access their inner experience and therefore detect the manipulation. What do they do? I would like to give you a taste of these acts by getting you to participate in a little experiment. I'm going to invite you to live a little experience, and then we will be interested in how you lived this experience. If you agree, take your time here and now to imagine a natural landscape that you like. You can close your eyes if you wish. And please raise your hand when you have got this landscape. Thank you. Now I propose you to answer silently the following questions. Which landscape was it? Was it an imaginary landscape or a landscape that you had seen before? To which part of the world does it belong? When you saw this landscape, what did you see? What were the elements of this landscape? Were there any colors in this landscape? Which colors? How was the light of the scene? Now, what was your point of view on this landscape? Did you see it as if it was a photograph or a film? Or were you inside the landscape? For those of you who saw a photo or a film, where did you see it? at the top, at the bottom, to the right, to the left? How far away was this image? How big was it? For those of you who were inside the landscape, were you seeing it out of your own eyes? Or were you seeing it from the eyes of another person in the landscape? Or from elsewhere in the scene? Was the visual scene accompanied by sound, any sounds, by any smells, by any tactile sensations? Take the time to retrieve that scene. What is it like to be in that landscape? How is its particular atmosphere? What does this landscape do to you? Do you feel anything, even very subtly? If so, what kind of feeling is this feeling? Is it located somewhere? Does this feeling have an extension, a volume, a particular texture? Now, I invite you to turn your attention towards the microgenesis of this experience. From the moment I invited you to imagine a natural landscape until the moment you raised your hand. Was the final landscape preceded by other candidate landscape? Did the final one appear at once, complete, or was it progressively constituted? In this last case, which sensorial dimension appeared first? Was it the visual, the tactile, the auditory, the olfactory, or maybe the feeling of the landscape, or anything else? Finally, when precisely did you know that you were imagining a landscape and raised your hand? Now, I invite you to leave that landscape and come back here and now in this room. I have one last question to ask you. What did you do internally in order to answer my questions? I assume that the first thing you did to answer my questions was to call back your experience of imagining a landscape. This inner act, consisting of retrieving or evoking the experience, is the first act we have to do in order to describe it. Evoking a past experience is a very specific process, which has been amazingly little studied until now. It falls within a type of memory which the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl called passive memory. We are always in the process of memorizing what we live, but most of the time involuntarily, without being aware of memorizing. For example, I suppose that you didn't voluntarily memorize the first thought you have when you woke up this morning. But you may be able to recall this thought and make it reappear. In the same way, in order to answer my questions, you were able to reenact your experience of imagining a landscape. Then, my questions aimed at helping you perform another inner act, diverting your attention from the content, the what of your experience, towards how it appeared to you. I started by asking questions on what you know about this landscape. Where it is, what are its objective elements? Then I progressively try to draw your attention towards something more evanescent, more intimate, somehow closer to you, your experience of that landscape, and the microgenesis of that experience, which might have been partly unrecognized at the initial moment. What does this reorientation of attention consist in? In Western psychology, it has been called introspection. You are supposed to reorient your attention from the external world to look inside yourself. However, the word introspection is extremely misleading. First, because becoming aware of one's experience doesn't consist in distancing oneself from it in order to observe it, but on the contrary, in reducing the distance, in coming closer to it. It's not a matter of splitting oneself into two in order to look at one's experience, but on the contrary, of coming into contact with it. As Merleau-Ponty wrote, this act doesn't consist in raising ourselves above our perception of things, but to plunge into it, to dig it out and enlarge it. This contact with experience is not elicited by reorienting the focus of one's attention from the what towards the how, but in abandoning the focused, active, inquisitive mode of attention for an open and receptive mode. It's not a matter of stretching toward experience to scrutinize it, recognize it, and characterize it, but of letting oneself be touched by it, be impregnated by it. It's a little like when you smell a perfume. You do not tense your nose towards the rose. You relax, and you make all your body receptive to it. Coming into contact with one's experience doesn't mean either diverting one's attention from the external objects towards an inner world, to introspect. Because when we free ourselves from the absorption into the objects of experience, to explore our experience of the objects, the separation which is usually perceived between an inner and an outer world proves to be much more permeable. Performing these inner acts of evocation and conversion of attention is a skill which can be learned. These acts may also be triggered and accompanied through relevant prompts and questions in the context of an interview, such as a microphenomenological interview. Let me add that unlike the sort of collective interview that I've just proposed, a microphenomenological interview is not made up of predetermined questions. It has nothing to do with a questionnaire. On the contrary, each question is based on the previous answer. To give you an idea, here is a short excerpt of an interview. So, the interviewer: if you agree, I would like you to come back to the moment I asked you. Take your time here and now to imagine a natural landscape that you like. What happened then? At that moment, the thought I had in my head vanished. How did it vanish? Was it instantaneous or gradual? It was very quick, but it nevertheless took a moment. And what happened during this moment? I loosened my tension on that thought. And when you loosen your tension on that thought, what do you loosen? In fact, I loosen a light tension in my head. Where exactly is this light tension in your head? it's at the top to the right and at the front of the head. And when you loosen it, how do you go about it? What do you do? And so on. As you can notice, the questions of the interviewer are empty of content. They are limited to drawing the subject's attention to the various moments of the experience without suggesting any content. For example, what happened first? What happened then? Another key question consists in questioning the verbs of action used by the interviewee. For example, when she says, I loosen a tension, the interviewer asks, when you loosen this tension, what do you do? This question is at the same time very precise, very focused, and non-inductive because completely empty of content. It helps the interviewee stabilize her attention on inner micro-gesture and provide a precise description without infiltrating any presupposition. The question, how do you know that your attention is now loosened? Draw the interviewee's attention towards very implicit criteria of accurate realization of this micro-gesture. The slowing down of the verbal flow, the presence of hesitations and silences, co-verbal gestures, the use of action verbs in the present tense are then clues that the subject is not reciting ready-made knowledge, but is discovering unnoticed processes. Microphenomenological interviews have an iterative structure which consists in helping the subject to evoke the experience to be described several times, while guiding their attention towards a diachronic match which is finer each time. The resulting descriptions are very fine-grained. To give you an idea, the average length of an interview is 1 hour to describe a few seconds of experience. This interview method, the microphenomenological interview method, is an adaptation of the entretien d'explicitation created by the French psychologist Pierre Vermersch. The method was initially developed to help persons engaged in professional practices to become aware of the implicit part of their actions and transfer their expertise. On the instigation of Francisco Varela, this interview method was then adapted to the domain of cognitive science to describe any type of lived experience. It has been complemented, on the one hand, by a method for analyzing verbal reports and detecting regularities in the form of generic structures, which is a very important point that I cannot develop now. And on the other hand, by methods of validation of these results. This psychological microscope has been used to study lived experience in many domains. To give you a few examples, from the experience of learning mathematics at school to the experience of listening to music, from the experience of synesthesia to the experience of surprise, from the experience of virtual environments to the experience of museum spaces, from the anticipation of epileptic seizures to attention processes in top athletes, from the experience of pain in fibromyalgic patients to the experience of selecting a fabric in clothing design, and the experience of practicing meditation. Microphenomenological interviews are also used to identify the experiential correlates of neural activities in so-called microphenomenological projects. May I add that this psychological microscope is especially useful to understand how the use of digital technologies transform our cognitive processes. In order to support this evolution in a relevant way and identify and prevent possible risks. For example, comparing macro descriptions of the activity of traditional readers and digital readers would enable us to understand precisely how digital reading transforms our activity of reading. The same type of research could be done to understand how digital writing transforms our way of thinking. It could also help to understand the effect of the dissociation between communication and bodily presence in digital communication devices. Now, what does the process of coming into close contact with one's experience enable us to discover? Releasing our usual absorption into the object or content of experience enables us to become aware of the usually invisible microgenesis of this content, such as the microgenesis of a choice or that of an inner image that we began to explore together, but also the microgenesis of a thought, of an emotion, of an illusion. Amazingly, these microgenesis unfold in a dimension where the structures that we usually consider as the most solid and the most essential to experience seem to vanish. In other words, experience is not at all what we think it is. First, in this dimension of our experience, the qualitative difference that we usually perceived between abstract thought and bodily sensations reduces. Experience is first felt. And in this felt dimension, the rigid separation between body and thought becomes more permeable. Think, for example, as a researcher or teacher, of the emergence of a new idea when it first emerges as a presentiment, a direction of thought which silently guides research. For instance, a well-known scientist that you will probably recognize described the emergence of his main idea as follows. For all these years, there was a feeling of direction, of heading straight for something concrete. It's of course very difficult to express this feeling in words, but I had it in a sort of overview and in a certain way visually. The space of an idea, even a very abstract one, such as the theory of relativity, far from being an abstract geometrical space, is an inner landscape with a very specific texture, a density, contrasts of rhythms and intensities, in which the rigid separation that we usually establish between body and mind vanishes. This felt space is also characterized by a certain permeability of the border usually felt between inner and outer space. It's easier to become aware of this aspect when the tension towards the object releases, especially in perceptive processes. For example, when a sound occurs, my attention usually focuses on the physical event at the origin of the sound. this focused attention has an impact of the structure of my lived space. The object is out there, far from me who am here. This mode of listening creates a distance, a separation between the perceived object and the perceiving subject. When a sound occurs, instead of going in search of the sound, listening out towards it, I can also make myself receptive to it, letting the sound come to me, letting myself be touched by it. Pulsation, beat, caress, shiver, the dimension of the experience which is then discovered is made up of imperceptible dynamic modification of intensity, orientation, amplitude, texture, and rhythm. Listening like this, a little as we listen to a piece of music, creates a sort of rhythmic attunement between bodily space and outer space, which has the effect of softening the limit between the two spaces. As you may have noticed in your experience of imagining a landscape, in visual perception too, loosening the tension towards the object has the effect of weakening the bodily boundaries. For example, a woman I interviewed told me how she suddenly discovered what it is to see this way. It was on a spring day, and she was watching the yellow flowers in a garden. Suddenly, she said, I felt what it is actually to see. To see is not casting your gaze towards something, projecting it, but really it's letting the color, the landscape, imprints, come to you. You're there and you receive it. And you have the impression that the color, the landscape, imprints itself inside you. What is also interesting in this testimony is that this gesture of loosening enabled this woman to begin to accept a very painful grief. By letting herself be impregnated by the yellow color of the flowers of her garden, she began to recover. In the felt dimension, the frontier usually perceived between the sensorial modalities also becomes more permeable. For example, the feeling of direction that led Einstein to the theory of relativity seems both kinesthetic and visual. In a different domain, the psychanalyst Theodor Reik describes the subtle inner sensations that guide him in the course of the therapeutic session, sometimes as visual, as nuances and fleeting psychic shadows, sometimes as auditory, as almost imperceptible half-tones, and sometimes as tactile, as little incoherencies, slight irregularities that are not visible but perceptible to touch when a hand slides carefully and softly over a fabric. These feelings do not fall within a specific sensory modality. They are, strictly speaking, neither images, nor kinesthetic or tactile sensations, nor sounds. However, they have precise sensory submodality, such as intensity, direction, and rhythm, which have the characteristic of being transmodal. Unlike temperature, which is specific to touch, or color, which is specific to sight, intensity is not specific to a particular sense, but can be transposed from one sense to another. In the first dimension of experience, the border usually perceived between the different sensorial registers dissolves somehow. Finally, the more we come into contact with our experience, the more the structures that we usually consider as essential to it, such as the separation between body and mind, between inner and outer space, between the sensorial modes, seem to vanish. This makes it increasingly difficult to answer the question, what is experience? Interestingly, this felt dimension, and especially its transmodal aspect, seems to be the word that babies experience. As the psychiatrist Daniel Stern highlighted from very detailed observations of mothers and child interactions, completed by microanalytic interview with mothers, the word infants experience is not a word of images, sounds, and tactile sensations, but a word of subtle modifications of movement, intensities, and rhythms. In other words, a word of transmodal qualities that Stern calls vitality dynamics. A baby doesn't perceive acts as such as we do, reaching for the baby's bottle, unfolding the diaper, but the vitality dynamics bound to these acts. How his mother holds him, how she takes the bottle, folds the diaper, combs her hair or her baby's hair. These rhythms also enable the affect attunement between mother and child. From moment to moment, in a pre-reflective way, mother and child attune their inner rhythms. For example, a mother will reply to the babbling of a baby with a caress of the same intensity and the same rhythm. This rhythmic synchronization, which enables the resonance or tuning of two inner universes, seems to be the basis of affective intersubjectivity. Stern's research led him to the conclusion that this dynamic and transmodal word doesn't correspond to a stage of the child's development, which is then abandoned to make way for other modes of functioning. On the contrary, this stratum of experience remains active throughout life, although generally below the threshold of consciousness. Beneath the perceptions, emotions, thoughts, and actions that constitute our conscious experience, this silent stratum is always with us. It is the very stuff of our experience. It is this subtle dynamic dimension that the music composer, the choreographer, the poet, or the painter try to express. It is in this dimension, in which even abstract thought seems to be anchored, that meaning relies. As a conclusion, I would like to ask the following question. What would be the effect of recognizing the felt dimension of experience on the educational level? For at present, teaching consists in most cases in transmitting conceptual and discursive contents of knowledge. But if understanding an idea means accessing the felt meaning which is at its source, are our teaching methods appropriate? Are they able to create real understanding? Which teaching methods, instead of only transmitting abstract contents of knowledge, could help students come into contact with the felt dimension of their experience, where meaning has its source? If not only the understanding of ideas, but their very genesis is rooted in bodily experience, how can this genesis be fostered and accompanied? What could be the role of digital technologies in this process? Answering this type of questions would require microphenomenological investigations of the processes of ideation and understanding, for example. This could be done in different types of teaching situations, non-mediated or mediated by more or less rich devices on the sensorial level, in order to assess, for example, the effect of the dissociation between communication and bodily presence. Such teaching method, by allowing students to come in touch with the depth of their experience, could re-enchant school and foster the creativity needed to create novel solutions to the thorny problems our society is facing. Thank you very much for your attention. Do you have any comments or questions, reactions to this presentation? Yes, John?
It's wonderful. Would you say something about why you think that as, in a sense, something like a phenomenological reduction happens, we start to become closer to experience. As we're doing that, we move into a more transmodal mode of description. What do you think is happening there? Why is that happening? Or is that too hard a question?
It's very hard.
Do you have any speculation about what's going on?
No, for me it is a mystery.
I mean,
do you have an hypothesis? I'm sure you have.
But it made me one thing it made me think of is just the idea in grounded cognition that Larry Barcelou works on. It's called grounded cognition.
Yeah.
Is that concepts, and this sort of works against but it's sometimes called the classical notion of concepts as basically referring to ideal universals or archetypes or what have you. That in grounded cognitions are actually, concepts are actually formed multimodally. And there's experimental evidence for this. So that my concept of a cup is actually a bunch of different sensory modalities bound together. And that they're encoded multimodally in sensory modalities. So that I'm wondering whether part of what's happening is that, in a sense, as we start to attend more and more to the concepts that we're using to describe experience, that's the multimodality of concepts itself begins to surface. But that was just one thing that occurred to me. I don't know if you've thought of that at all. Like maybe concepts actually, maybe the grounded cognition is right. Concepts, as we, in some ways what's happening here is we're getting closer to the concepts that we use to describe our own experience. And maybe they begin to, in a way, become actually clearer, which makes them seem less clear because we don't usually think of them as multimodal or where all the modalities are bound together.
Yes, it's an interesting hypothesis. But for me, it's really a research to be done, to be done empirically.
Yes, exactly. It would be interesting to think about how to do that.
So perhaps a simpler question about the practical applications of the microphenomenology interview. How far after an experience do you find that it's useful? Could it be at any point? I'm interested in sort of the development progression, and being familiar with Stern's work, I'm fascinated by what you posed in terms of vitality dynamics and thinking about applications in education for children who were at one point inside their mother's body, so those rhythms were a shared experience, and then you're outside of the mother's body and becoming separate and then learning language. Could it be used with children to get at experience prior to those systems coming online, and then thinking about their experience in education? Could parallels be made there?
So your question is when can we use the method to at which age?
Yeah,
so
and then even with adults, how far back might you go? And in a
yes. So the other question is about the distance between the interview and the experience. So two questions in fact. So the method initially has been used in an educational context by Pierre Vermersch because it was taught to the teachers in France, to the the future teachers now it is not done anymore, but for many years teachers have been taught this method, l'entretien d'explicitation, and they used it in primary school, so with children from 6 to 10. Personally, I've not tried that, and my colleagues have not. I mostly interviewed adults, so I have no personal experience of interviewing children, but I know it is possible. Now, for the distance between the experience and the interview, it's the process of evocation, which is very amazing, in fact, seems to make it possible to access a far past experience. I interviewed, when I did my thesis with Francisco Varela on the intuitive experience, the experience of having an intuition. I interviewed astrophysician of an intuition he had 20 years ago. And it was a very, very precise and interesting interview. He gave many details that he became aware of at the time of the interview. It was very. You can also make an interview of on an experience that has just happened. For example, the experience of imagining a landscape. Then we had a sort of collective interview on a very, very, very fresh experience. And even so, and you can adapt the method. For example, recently I've tried something new. It was to interrupt the interview and to redo the experience during the interview. It was in the context of interviewing meditation practitioners. So they meditate a little for a while, and then we do the interview on this moment of meditation. And for some questions, I just said, you could redo it right now. You could meditate again for a moment right now in order to answer my question. And it works very well. So I think in some context, it's possible to adapt very, de manière très souple, comment on dit très souple, très...
very flexibly.
Flexibly the method, yeah. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thanks to
Petitmengin.
you.